What does it take to lead a fulfilling life? According to a 2023 study from Pew Research, most Americans think one of the most important things you can do is have close friends. But despite valuing the idea of friendship so highly, many of us struggle to find it. In a global study of more than 55,000 people, the BBC found that a third reported feeling lonely on a regular basis. And those numbers were even higher among young adults. That gap between what we say we value and how we're actually living our lives, I think it's fueling a lot of the unhappiness in our society. And as I say this, I'm realizing I'm not just reporting the statistics, I'm living them. Sure, I have lots of people I enjoy talking with, but I can say that outside of family, there are more than a few people that I can share my deepest concerns with. And even fewer I can count on when the going gets tough. It's not that I'm an antisocial kind of guy. It's just that, until recently, I'm realizing that I may not have been paying enough attention to my friendships. In college, I had several great friends I confided in. We were always there for each other. But then, life continued to happen. I got a job, I moved several times, I had kids. And it just became a little too easy to put my friendships on the back burner. And suddenly all those friends I used to talk with regularly, for some of them, I can't even remember exactly the last time we spoke. And to tell you the truth, when I stop to think about this now, I'm not really happy with my state of affairs. So over the past year, I've begun to rethink my approach to friendship and ask myself what being a good friend really means. To help me figure it all out, I decided to ask two people who spend a lot of time thinking about friendship. Today on the show, we're going to talk to Dr. Robert Waldinger, director of the Harvard Study on Adult Development, about how and why good friendships play a key role in flourishing.
One of the strongest predictors of who stayed not just happy, but who stayed healthy as they got into old age was the people who had the best connections with others.
And with philosopher Samuel Kimbriel, founding director of the Aspen Institute's Philosophy and Society program, and author of the book Friendship as Sacred Knowing, about how to be a good friend, and why embracing a spiritually informed perspective on friendship might just provide some of the best answers.
A good friend, the kind of friend that you actually want, is one that helps you with the meaning of life question, because they themselves are pursuing what it means to be a good person. The world is somehow bigger than both people, and both people are pushing and prompting each other towards something that is larger than either of them on their own.
I'm Dave DeSteno. Welcome to Season 9 of How God Works. In 1938, a group of researchers at Harvard embarked on what would become one of the longest-running studies of human life ever conducted. They started with a group of Harvard undergraduates, including future U.S. President John F. Kennedy, and later, a separate group was added, this one made up of young men from some of Boston's poorest and most disadvantaged families. The researchers wanted to figure out what would make the difference between who eventually thrived and who didn't. So they collected massive amounts of information about each of them. They ran medical exams, interviewed family members, and asked the young men detailed questions about their lives, including prompts to reflect on their experiences and why they made the choices they did. And then the researchers just kept following the young men for the rest of their lives, as they went off to war, got their first jobs, fell in love, and started families. Or stayed single. Some died young, while others would become great-grandparents. Some lived quiet lives, while others made it to the top of their fields. And along the way, the study grew to include the participants' spouses and their children too, building a unique, multi-generational record of human experience. So at this point, with more than 80 years of data, the study has revealed all sorts of things about the factors shaping people's lives. But one particular finding was so surprising and so significant that Bob Waldinger and his colleague Mark Schultz decided to write a best-selling book about it, titled The Good Life.
We found that one of the strongest predictors of who stayed not just happy, but who stayed healthy as they got into old age was the people who had the best connections with others. That more social connection and warmer relationships predicted who was going to be healthy and happy as they got into their 70s and 80s.
So why was this such a surprise? According to Bob, it wasn't news that relationships matter in our lives. As those Pew statistics show, most of us know that. The real revelation was just how much relationships matter, not only to our happiness, but to our physical health.
How could the warmth of your relationships get into your body and make it less likely that you'd get type 2 diabetes or arthritis or coronary artery disease? How could that possibly be, right? We see years difference in longevity. We see difference in what we call disability-free life years. It's a public health term. And so what we find is that you can actually demonstrate the effect of more social connection on these parameters. So of course we were surprised because nobody had an idea of what the mechanism would be by which this could actually happen.
It's not just the Harvard study. Lots of other research has now confirmed the same pattern. People who feel connected to others live longer, healthier, and happier lives. And those connections can take many forms. It could be a romantic partner, close family and friends, tight-knit coworkers, or community ties. Believe it or not, even daily interactions with your favorite cashier at the store can make a difference. And what seems to matter most isn't necessarily how many of these relationships you have, but their quality. And whether you feel that someone will be there when you need their support. That sense of security may be the first clue to how relationships reach beyond our emotions and into our bodies.
The best hypothesis we have, for which there's now more and more data, is that it has to do with stress. So, stress is a part of our lives. I mean, I might have something happen an hour from now that's really going to stress me out, and my body will undergo all these changes. My blood pressure will go up, my heart rate will go up, I might start to sweat. That's normal. That's the fight or flight response. And then our bodies are meant to go back to baseline when the stress is removed. That's all good. But what we think happens is that when you don't have anyone you can go home and complain to, you can call on the phone and talk about your stressful day to, when you don't have that and you're isolated, we believe that the body stays in a kind of low-level fight or flight response. And what that means is that there are higher levels of circulating stress hormones like cortisol. There is an elevated level of inflammation in the body. And what we think happens then is that these changes, when they're ongoing, when you don't ever come down back to baseline, they gradually break down body systems, which is how, for example, loneliness in one person could affect their coronary arteries and in another person could affect their joints.
Do you think the reason we actually experience loneliness as pain? I mean, there have been times in my life when I felt lonely that it feels like a deep ache kind of in my chest. Is that pain, even though at that moment nothing is physically wrong, is that the brain in some senses saying, hey, you better act on this because there's a long-term detriment if you don't?
Well, that's a good point. That maybe that's our evolutionary mechanism, our warning signal to say, hey, you need to do something about this. Because we do know, for example, that people sleep less soundly when they're alone. And we think that evolutionarily we developed to be in groups because it was safer. You're more likely to pass on your genes if you're in a group. And so it may be that the body has developed these warning signals to say, hey, you need to be less isolated.
But if loneliness feels so bad, why is it so common? Part of the answer may be that we tend to get in our own way. Psychologist Nick Epley has run a series of studies showing that people consistently underestimate how rewarding connection will be. Commuters, for example, predicted that striking up a conversation with a stranger on the train would be unpleasant or distracting. But when Epley asked them to do it anyway, both sides enjoyed it. In another study, people underestimated how much they and their friends would value helping one another. Though as it turned out, both the giver and the receiver felt happier when they did. Again and again, our mistaken assumptions stop us from taking the first step to connect. Where did these misguided ideas come from? Well, the culture we live in might just be playing a role. In many modern societies, value systems and social structures have shifted in ways that leave people more isolated than ever before. Long work hours and economic pressures may leave us shorter on time for friends. And with extended families living further apart than they used to, we often have less support too. The way we use technology tends to leave us feeling less connected, not more. And these are just some of the factors pushing communities apart. There's a line in Bob's book that puts it all pretty succinctly. The good life may be a central concern for most people, but it is not the central concern of most modern societies. That rings especially true to me in our current achievement and status-obsessed moment. And if society isn't built to help us stay connected, that means it's largely up to us to figure out how to build and sustain strong friendships. That's why Bob says it makes sense to think of this in terms of social fitness. Just like physical fitness, it isn't something you can just achieve and check off your list. It's a practice. You get stronger by coming back to the exercises again and again.
There's actually research on this, believe it or not, on how people make friends. So in terms of bringing new people into your life, if you don't have enough people in your life, research shows that one of the easiest ways to make new friends is to do something you enjoy or something you care about with other people who you don't yet know, and go back again and again to the same group and do that thing you like. And what you'll find is that you have a shared interest with the people you're with that's bringing you together. So you have an easy place to start up conversations. You have an easy subject for casual conversation. And that what happens then is that some of these casual new relationships deepen. Not most, but a few. And then some of them can really become friendships. You know, it's sort of like what we tell our kids when they go to a new school. We say, join a club. You know, do something you want to do, but do it with other kids. Well, it works the same for us grown-ups. So that's one of the most important ways we can bring new people into our lives.
And how about in friendships or relationships you have already?
In our study, the people who were the best at social fitness were the people who made small efforts over and over again. You know, it's easy, was for me, until I did this research, it's easy to think that, oh, my relationships are there. They're good relationships. They'll take care of themselves. And that's not true. Actually, perfectly good relationships can wither away and even die off completely because we lose touch. So the people who were best at keeping relationships vibrant were the people who just reached out over and over again. So maybe it's texting somebody every day or every week or even every month. Maybe it's scheduling a phone call regularly with someone who you want to make sure you're always current with in their life. Maybe it's scheduling something that you're going to do anyway, but you arrange it so you do it with another person. So let's say, Dave, you don't exercise enough. What if you schedule meetings at the gym with a buddy? And you go there to...
I'll get a twofer.
You get a twofer. You get to see your friend, and you're more likely to show up and do it because that person's waiting for you.
We can all take simple steps like these to strengthen our social fitness. But just like getting to the gym regularly, it can be hard to sustain. That's one reason why religion has long been one of the most powerful tools for building connection. Part of why it's so effective is that it comes with practices built in, rather than relying on individual initiative. Weekly gatherings, rituals that bind us, and acts of service are all designed to bring people together. And almost every tradition has practices that nudge people to step outside of themselves and learn to show up for each other, even those you might not think of as especially social. Bob knows this firsthand, as he leads a small Zen community called the Henry David Thoreau Sangha, or HANK for short. With its quiet hours of meditation and attempts to practice non-attachment, Zen might not seem like the obvious choice for building social fitness. But according to Bob, these practices aren't meant to take us out of the world. They're actually tools to help us connect more deeply to it.
Non-attachment means something particular in the Zen tradition. It means not being so wedded to one view, one idea, that you can't entertain the complexity of life, right? So that's different from saying, I don't want to be attached to my wife of 39 years. Like, that's a bad thing, right? No. Or I don't want to take joy from being with my new grandson. Oh my God, no. Zen is about really experiencing the full joy of being with this little 4-month-old and watching him learn to giggle. That's just incredible, right? So what Zen says is that when we cling really tightly to one particular view of life, we usually suffer, and we often make other people suffer. So I have to be a certain way no matter what. My child has to be a certain way no matter what. Think of all the suffering that gets generated when we get attached, in the Buddhist term, to one particular way of being in the world. That's one example of what they mean by trying not to be as attached. But to experience the joy of human connection, that's what Zen is all about.
There's this other notion in Buddhism, which I assume applies to Zen as well, which is that everything has Buddha nature, which is basically every person has within them a spark of goodness. And many other traditions have this too. So I'm wondering, as you go into the world, does assuming that people are good as opposed to being out to get you or just in it for themselves, does that shape how you respond to them or your willingness to form friendships?
Yes, it does. Giving people so much the benefit of the doubt, realizing that nobody gets up in the morning saying, I'm excited about doing harm, right? Most people don't do that. Most people get up in the morning and they're trying to do what they can to get through life and to be okay. We're all doing that. And so when I remember that, it really helps me be less judgmental. There was a 19th century clergyman who told his congregation, be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a great battle. And I think when I remember that, even the people who are driving me crazy now in our political life, I have to remember, okay, they're each fighting their own great battle. Sometimes I think they're the wrong battles, but they're struggling. They're trying to do what they can.
Every new friendship begins with one person extending their hand. But we're only going to do that, to take a chance on reaching out to someone, if we believe they're worth it. If we believe they'll reach back. And that problem of how to change the way we view other people in the world around us is one that philosophers and religious thinkers can help with.
I think that the question of loneliness and friendship is something that's haunting our society in particular.
Philosopher Sam Kimbriel spends a lot of time thinking about what friendship means, why it's so difficult, and what we can learn from thinkers throughout history, including people like the novelist David Foster Wallace, who often wrote about the ache of loneliness in modern life.
One of the stories that I always used to think a lot about, which is titled something like A Radically Condensed History of Post-Industrial Life. And almost the entire story runs something like this. He made a witticism hoping to be liked. She laughed too hard hoping to be liked. And they both drove home alone with the same twist in their faces. And the reason I have thought about the story is possibly some like personal pain, but also I think much more specifically that it feels like it's getting down to something like the kind of longings that people feel right now, which is a desire for friendship, a desire for romantic connection, a feeling like those are in some way central to the meaning of life, but then also a feeling like they're constantly miscarrying, that you're not quite able to pull off the kinds of relationships in the depth and level of intimacy or trust that you want to.
If it's so important to us, and we know it's important for our health and our well-being, why is it so hard to get right, do you think? I mean, when we're hungry, we eat, and we all know how to eat. When we, feel the desire to reproduce, we have sex and we produce. We want to be good friends, but it doesn't seem to come as naturally to us.
Maybe part of the problem is that people often think of this as something that should be simple, easy, and achievable, whereas it's actually quite a hard skill. And many of the things that we value most about life are actually very hard skills.
That idea resonates with what Bob Waldinger told us earlier. Connection matters a lot, but it isn't always easy to achieve or maintain. Which leads Sam to a harder question.
I think that the question for philosophy, but also for human life, is what if we never quite achieve it? Does that throw us into despair? And I think that's like kind of the knife's edge where our society is right now. We know it's important to human life, but we're also no longer clear whether we might even achieve it.
But why does connection seem so hard to achieve right now? Sam says it goes deeper than just our habits or the effort we put in, although those certainly play a role. He thinks it also has to do with our starting assumptions about the kind of world we think we're living in.
One of the core crises of our civilization is the question of harmony. Some philosophers, Descartes probably is one of them, people like Hobbes, I think Nietzsche, tend to think actually the baseline part of reality is randomness, violence, chance, and so you should win. This is like a very familiar kind of view, especially like in a kind of post-Darwin world where you think, okay, the world's not going to be there for me. It's not going to be able to protect me. And so my job is to survive and to be successful.
But the thing is, beliefs about the world don't just stay in our heads. They tend to shape how we act and how we relate to other people.
So if you think that the world is randomness and chance and is out to get you, it might be the right ethic. Like, actually, the moral thing to do might be to try to be self-defensive and maybe even manipulative. This is close to what Machiavelli tends to argue, that, hey, if the world doesn't have any sort of deeper structure to it, maybe you should just win. And there are certainly, I think, a lot of people in our world, in our society, that tend to think of the world in that way. And as a philosopher, I think it's a very serious view and one that we should have to grapple with very directly.
This view of the world as fundamentally chaotic has deep roots. But according to Sam, it's far from being a given.
There's a whole different set of philosophers, a completely other part of the tradition, that think, yes, there's definitely an aspect of reality that involves chance and randomness and suffering and fate, but there's also another aspect that involves harmony and coherence and love. And they tend to think that there is something either in the world itself that's deeply harmonious or that is transcendent above the world, that is before the world, and then the world somehow comes from it and shares in it. And in that side, I think that the Stoics fit there. There's certain versions of Buddhism that fit there. It shows up in Aristotle. There's definitely most of Platonism, both like in its own like pagan variant, but also in Islamic versions. And then also Christianity all fit on that side.
In a chaotic world, self-preservation might seem like the only safe response. But if your worldview has harmony at its core, that opens the door to a very different ethic. As a devout Episcopalian, Sam finds striking examples of this in his own tradition.
The part of the Christian tradition that I think is unique, you get it a little bit in these other fragments, but it's specifically the idea of the most powerful thing also being willing to serve the least powerful. It's that kind of inversion of the dynamic that you get in Hobbes or Machiavelli, where in those thinkers, what they say is, if you're powerful, you should use it effectively. That's the key imperative. Whereas in the Christian tradition, you get these like weird inversions where people say, no, actually, the most powerful thing, God himself, ends up taking on the least powerful station and serving the weakest. And so then in human life also, power ends up getting these kinds of weird inversions. I'm interested in it both in a theoretical way because it's a very striking argument that there is something in the universe that you can trust. That seems like a very, very powerful way of trying to figure out what human life is. And also personally, I think that running the experiment in my own life about what it's like to think that vulnerability is more real than power, self-protection, has struck me as a really valuable thing to be pursuing.
Values like service and vulnerability certainly sound friendlier than self-interest, but they can also feel pretty abstract. After all, I'd venture to say that most of us don't identify as Machiavellian schemers. But according to Sam, even a subtle drift toward one worldview or the other can have very concrete consequences.
It's interesting. I live now in DC, and one of the things that really struck me when I moved there is that no one seems to ever ask anyone else to help them move. Everywhere else that I've lived, people buy 20 pizzas and then you just like throw your sofa into a big truck and truck it off somewhere. Whereas in DC, it seems like, on the one hand, a place that's full of successful people and also people who are just full of ambition that really want, first of all, to have their lives be able to kind of climb a particular ladder. And so my guess is that what's going on there is that people don't want to use their social capital. They know that there's like something that has to do with social life, but they don't want to use their social capital to be vulnerable having someone touch their sofa. They want to have that person help them get published at The Atlantic. And that difference, I think, is actually one of real isolation. So what ends up happening then is that if you don't have someone who's willing to touch your sofa, you also don't have someone who's going to be there for you when you get cancer. So there's a kind of like withdrawal of actual genuine dependency. My own intuition and also a lot of the practices that I try to foster in the other direction, which is to think, no, like actual, both like emotional dependencies, but also genuine material and physical dependencies matter. If you have a community that you're willing to rely on at that level, that there's an ethic there that's much closer to what the purpose of life is.
To many people today, the idea that we should be more dependent on others can sound absurd, maybe even dangerous if we see the world as a place where everyone is out for themselves. But that may help explain why so many of us are lonely. Whatever the true nature of the cosmos is, traditions that emphasize harmony can help remind us that needing others and being needed isn't a dangerous weakness, it's a great strength. That said, connection is only the first step. As Bob Waldinger reminds us, friendship has to be nurtured if it's going to help us flourish. So what do these traditions have to say about what makes a good friend?
Aristotle very famously divides friendship into three categories. So he has a category of friendship for pleasure, which is just mutual enjoyment, for use, which is that you have something that you're getting from this person that's not just that the joy of that person themselves. But then he also thinks that the highest version of friendship is friendship in virtue. And by that, he means that the world is somehow bigger than both people, and that both people are pushing and prompting each other towards something that is larger than either of them on their own. And so one of the places that I tend to really disagree with a lot of the contemporary conversation about friendship is that it's treated as an ethical or personal or political problem only. Whereas I tend to think it's actually totally tied to the crisis of meaning. The reason that, for example, we have this whole large conversation about male loneliness and the way that that's creating these complicated political dynamics is, I think, in part because people don't know what their lives are for. So the meaning of life question and the meaning of relationship question end up going very closely together. And what Aristotle argues is that a good friend, the kind of friend that you actually want, is one that helps you with the meaning of life question, because they themselves are pursuing what it means to be a good person and will potentially have some real insights about that you can trust. And so when you're trusting them, you're not just trusting them arbitrarily, you're trusting them very specifically that they might actually have an insight into what you should do with your life and how it should be beneficial.
So from this view then, what makes a good friend?
What counts as a good friend, I think, is someone who both sees you recognizes you, doesn't have a highly like inflated or fabricated vision of you. It's not a fantasy. And they're willing to do two things. One, to be deeply present with you and care for you. And two, be honest with you. And if you can pull off someone who has both of those things, it strikes me as much more likely to be the kind of relationship that you can build your life around longer term.
This raises an interesting question to me, because right now there's a lot of talk about people forming friendships with AI chatbots.
Yeah.
And part of the reason, I mean, there are actually studies. One came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science where people say, I feel more heard by AI chatbots than by humans. Part of that is we're learning is because they pretty much want to reinforce you, whatever you think, whatever you say. Yet you're raising the view that being a good friend means being empathetic in a much broader sense, because sometimes to be supportive, you have to challenge a person and you have to work toward discovery and changing together. And so what are your feelings on AI chatbots getting us used to friends who are very sycophantic?
There is recognition in Silicon Valley that they basically agree with Aristotle. Among the most important things in life, social relationships, what it means to be with other humans actually matter more to us than almost anything else. And so they want this technology to be touching on that. It also, however, the version of social interaction that they tend to prioritize, at least as a default, is one that's like highly flattering. I mean, whenever I'm using it, it's constantly saying to me, oh, that's such a perceptive question. Oh, you've put your finger right on the main point, blah, 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 right? And, I think that tendency toward flattery is actually a way that they're trying to solve a technical problem, which is the mechanism of this is actually not that smart. It doesn't really understand what's important in the world. Like, it doesn't have the criteria that Aristotle's talking about with friendship, which is that you yourself would have an independent sense of what's good and beautiful and true. And then that is able to be a kind of nourishment for your friend. And so they're trying to fabricate it a little bit by saying, okay, I'm just going to allow my attention to fall on whatever it is that particular user is trying to prompt me to in a given moment, and to make them think that it's a really good question. And, it kind of works on a lot of us, but I'm unconvinced that that's the basis for a good friendship. In my own experience of good friendship, the people that I've kept closest are the ones who I am most likely to be afraid of a little bit, where they are going to see things that I'm not sure that I want them to be able to see, and be honest about them in a fashion that is genuinely beneficial for me longer term.
For Sam, AI's biggest weakness as a friend is the same thing that makes some users say they prefer it to humans. It creates a frictionless relationship where the user is always right. But the best relationships don't only provide affirmation, they also sometimes challenge and unsettle us. So what should we make of that in the context of modern self-care culture? Is prioritizing our own comfort helping us thrive? Or is it making it too easy to recast friction in our relationships as toxicity and cut friendships loose?
Like there are all of these intuitions like, oh, wait, there's something good there. Like the ability to recognize that you do actually need to be nourished, that certain kinds of people you need to have boundaries with, and that you should actually be able to kind of be justified in doing that. There are all kinds of like sprinklings of something you're like, that's almost wise. I think part of my misgiving is that it tends to specifically still culminate in the individual and in the kind of like consumptive ethic that we've all been trained in and fostered. I guess that my own intuition here is that this is another place where Aristotle helps a lot. What's interesting in the Aristotelian thing is that the criterion that you're going to have friendship in virtue ends up cutting against both people equally. So on the one hand, it does cut against the other person who is abusive or is in some way demanding of you in a way that you shouldn't. And I think it absolutely would recommend what the kind of self-care literature is recommending, which is that you need to be actually extremely careful about vulnerabilities that are inappropriate. And, that's totally my view as well. What's also interesting, though, is that the criterion for in virtue cuts against you equally, which means that you have to be the kind of person that is, just good, actually interested in the other person, caring about them for their own sake, not just wanting them for something they can give to you, and so on. And so you end up getting like a little bit of the sweetness and a little bit of the bitterness in this recommendation. And I do think actually the people that I know that tend to have the happiest relationships are people who end up taking it on in that kind of spirit, not just in the, this is going to help me kind of realize my own self-actualization.
Friendship in virtue can serve as a corrective to pure self-interest. But the fact that we so often seem to need that nudge points to a deeper issue.
If I'm assessing where we are as a society, I think basically the theory of individualism is failing. That we developed a kind of picture about autonomous humanity that maybe worked for a certain period, but that it actually ended up showing itself to be pretty thin. And the degree to which we're now finding ourselves stumbling into a world where we have to come up with an alternative version to that, it's an extremely messy process. But I also am very optimistic, in part because I think that the world has harmony to it, that there are resources here that may not occur to us immediately, but are going to show up as we start asking and facing those kinds of fractures directly.
One place Sam sees those resources already waiting is in spiritual traditions. Because in addition to offering tools to enhance our social fitness and build community, they invite us to shift our entire worldview away from the myth of autonomous individuals and toward a reality where we're all part of a larger harmony. The effects of that shift can be profound.
So there's a very famous passage in Augustine's Confessions where he has a friendship in his youth and into his late teenage years, who his friend then suddenly dies very violently. And in that instance, he says, "Oh, it's as though I've lost half of my own soul." So that kind of an identification where even his ability to know what he himself is as a person is somehow ripped apart or lost in the nature of friendship, that strikes me as very close to the kind of real difference that this tradition of harmony that we're talking about would kind of prompt. That you yourself are not actually, first of all, an individual, but that something about what it means to be human at all is tied to love in a very deep and primal kind of way.
Whether it's Christianity, Zen Buddhism, or any number of other traditions, spirituality provides a vast array of resources to help connect us more deeply. And that's likely one reason why people who engage with religion report lower levels of loneliness. But it's also important to remember that religion isn't strictly necessary. These tools and perspectives are open to all of us, and so are the daily choices we make to look for the good, to be of service, to rely on others, and ask deeper questions of them. In my case, I'm trying to do all of the above. I've made it a point to reach out more frequently to people I know, to ask them how their lives are going, rather than just talk about work. I've also volunteered to do some grocery shopping for my neighbor, who is facing some physical hardships. And I have to say, I'm happier doing it than I expected. Plus, our relationship has blossomed from one of acquaintance into something much more meaningful. So as I think about living a healthier life, I'm not just trying to get myself to the gym. I'm working on my social fitness too. And take it from me, a person who is putting these ideas into practice. Reaching out to friends isn't only more meaningful than an extra set of push-ups or substituting kale for fries. It's more enjoyable too. Truth be told, I haven't regretted it once. I don't think you will either. Next time on How God Works, if you're seeking a spiritual life, one with greater meaning, connection, and purpose, how do you get there?
A lot of pre-modern Western thought really privileged this idea of the vita contemplativa, the contemplative life, which was, think of like a monk in the Middle Ages, alone in his cell, poring over some scholarly tome, contemplating the Godhead, right?
On this episode of How God Works, I'm going to talk with journalist Sigal Samuel about the centuries-old debate over the spiritual life and how exactly to achieve it, through contemplation or activity.
The vita activa, which is sort of like, be very involved in the concrete real world, helping people with things like poverty or hunger, that became more privileged in the modern era, the active life.
And to Father Greg Boyle, Jesuit priest and founder of the world's largest gang intervention, rehabilitation, and prison reentry program.
I breathe it in, breathe it out. And it's a way of keeping me lovingly attentive to the bombardment that's about to happen as I walk into my office.
How to pursue goodness and spirituality for yourself and others? That's next time on How God Works. How God Works is hosted by me, Dave DeSteno. This episode was written by Sophie Eisenberg and me. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Our associate producer is Emmanuel Desarme. Executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. Our fact checker is Joseph Fridman. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. To learn more about the show and access episode transcripts, you can find our website at howgodworks, all one word, .org. And for news and peeks at what's coming, feel free to follow us on Instagram at howgodworkspod, or me on X or Blue Sky at David DeSteno.